All right, so for the title or for the camera, could you please state your name, rank, and residence?
Ah, well, my name is Dean Schofield, and I live in Holliston, Massachusetts, and I actually retired from the Navy Reserve as a captain in 1992.
So how did you come about living in Holliston?
I came about living in Holliston because that's where my mother and father were when I was born. They had left Yarmouth, where they lived earlier, and as a result of the Depression, for some reason that I can't remember, my father ended up in Holliston, and that's where I was born in 1942.
All right. So what inspired you to join the military?
Yeah, more of a story there. Have you guys studied much American history? World War II, for instance? I got a couple of questions for you, too. So.
We'll see how much we know.
No, the answer is probably not much. No, that's fine. I just wanted to... because World War II was a very significant event in American history. And it was the last time we've actually mobilized the whole country to go to war and with a war so much bigger than any of us could imagine. But what happened was I was born in the middle of that. My father was actually drafted 3 years after I was born. He was 37 years old and had 2 kids, and nonetheless was drafted to serve, and he did in the Army up through 1945. And you guys probably aren't familiar with the draft either. The draft it used to be that every male citizen of the United States had to serve, or had to sign up to serve in the armed forces. And that was the case with my father and his 3 brothers. All, actually, I think 2 of them volunteered, and the other 2 were drafted because they were much older. So it meant that I was born into a military family. And then what happened was virtually everybody, all of my friends' fathers, were veterans of one service or another. Served all over the world in World War II. So when I'm starting to grow up by 1948 I'm 6. Then growing up from there, we were constantly surrounded by people who had served before. I mean, the Memorial Day Parade in Holliston, which today is probably 500 feet long, was probably a half a mile long. There was so many people involved every time. And so that, for those of us who grew up in it, made us well aware of the military. And you felt an obligation because your parents had served, so it was time for us to do it. One of the other things, and particularly right here, I spent my summers from roughly 48 up until I started working in the late 50s at Thumpertown Beach, and you couldn't be there for very long without having a new flight of airplanes go by and start bombing the target ship that used to be out there in a bigger way than it is now. So there was a constant exposure there to aviation. And even in Holliston, when we were growing up as kids, there were airplanes like you couldn't believe. Constant military airplanes. So you couldn't ignore that. You couldn't ignore the anti-aircraft artillery shooting training in Wellfleet, where the seashore is now. So there was a great deal of involvement, and so we're predisposed to getting into the military in the first place. So when you're graduating from high school, I remember a friend of mine whose father happened to be in the Navy. We went in and met with the guidance counselor. Guidance counselor was looking through documents because we weren't through where we wanted to go to school. We were probably juniors at the time, and he had a folder that said Navy ROTC or a brochure, and he actually threw it in the wastebasket and said, "Yeah, you guys wouldn't be interested in that." And my friend, fortunately, reached over and because of his father's Navy connection and grabbed it. And as it turned out, we both signed up for a Navy ROTC program. Still basically the same today, I believe, but he went to the University of Michigan, I went to RPI. The program paid for all our tuition, paid all the fees, provided all the books, and in today's world probably a computer. And then they paid us the very nice sum at the time of $50 a month, which bought gasoline among other things. So that is, how I ended up in the Navy through the ROTC program.
So how did your family react to you joining the ROTC program?
Oh, they were pleased at that. That meant all they had to pay for was room and board. And because, they were all familiar with military service anyhow, it was kind of expected. So, and we felt an obligation. I'd say that it was general. In Holliston in 1960, our graduating class was something like 53, 25 roughly boys. I'm going to say half of the boys either went directly into the service or went to college and then in. So that, today, I'd hesitate to guess at what the percentage is out of Nauset High School, but it's probably a lot lower than that. So like I said, it's all around you. There you go. So parents were nothing unusual.
So what was it like day one of training?
Well, ROTC training is in a college environment, so that's pretty easy. You just go to another class and do it. Most people go to a boot camp, and if you're an enlisted soldier or sailor. With officers, that doesn't happen, and what we were training to be officers. We were midshipmen, actually, in the Navy was the title. So it was just something we did along with our regular school. It was as if you were taking a full course plus a lab. So it was probably somewhere between 5 and 8 hours a week throughout the entire 4-year program.
So when the Vietnam War started, what was your opinion of it?
The view I held, and still do, was that at that point communism was a major force in our world. It's actually difficult to even now think about just how major that was. The Soviet Union plus communist China at the time and a couple of other countries were, it was an overpowering, or not overpowering, it was a large force, and they were intent on spreading communism throughout the world. And we were there to say we'd rather you didn't. And so the Vietnam War, like the Korean War ahead of it, was a result that there were communism and democracy clashed at various points and times around the world, and resulted in armed conflict at times, and that's what Vietnam was. And built gradually over time. And my view was, well, we know we're going to fight them somewhere. Somebody's chosen this. Jack Kennedy, as it turned out. And so we'll go do it. At the same time, the primary emphasis, and this was true right up to 1990, of the U.S. military was actually defending Europe from a potential Soviet invasion, westward from the center of Russia. So while in Vietnam we eventually got up to 500,000 troops there, Americans, there were at least that many in Europe at the same time, and before and after. So there was major commitments, much bigger than what we're seeing today. But again, it became apparent that there was going to be conflict somewhere, and you can go into a great deal of history of Vietnam, but the point was that at least in my case, I accept that that's where it's going to be, I'll go, or if they send me.
So, day one of you arriving there, what were your thoughts?
In Vietnam?
In Vietnam.
That it was hot, I think, was the first thing. And it depends, people arrive in different ways. But it was actually quite tame. It was a very busy airport. A lot of fighter aircraft fighter bombers and helicopters flying around and all that stuff. But basically it was in the middle of the city of Da Nang. And so it was simply a matter of getting used to the fact that, this is a different part of the world that I hadn't been to. But in terms of, any kind of immediate stress, there really wasn't any.
So Da Nang was like an American control city?
Yeah, and I arrived there. Let me back up a step. The reason the reason I went there was because I was at that point a member of one of the Navy's construction battalions, Seabees, which I had joined, let me think, 9 months earlier, I guess. Which was created out of thin air, basically. Here's 2,000 guys out of boot camp, and we'll scrounge up a bunch of people. We went to Davisville, Rhode Island, and created construction battalions. Mine, which is number 58, was composed of about 750 men. 25 of them were officers. I was one of the officers. And then what we did was get construction training and military training in Rhode Island, and we had previously spent a month down in Camp Lejeune in North Carolina with the Marines for some field and heavier military type training that we could get in Rhode Island. So, and the way the Navy did it, unlike some of the other services in Vietnam, which rotated individual people into units that were already there, the Navy treated construction battalions the same way they did ships, which meant that the whole unit went as one. We trained up together, went as one unit, went over for 8 months, came back. Typical rotation was 8 over, 6 months back, regroup, retrain, get new people. People are rotating in and out of the battalion. Go back through the training cycle again, then go back a second time for another 8 months, and then you'd come back for 6 months. So I made 2 of those trips. And so when I first arrived in Vietnam, because the job I held at the time was the security function as the officer, I was what they call a battalion S2. The way we did that involved intelligence, planning, security, a whole bunch of non-construction related functions. And I was a construction guy and wasn't real happy with that, but it turned out to be a great experience because it was so broad and so many things I was responsible for. And it also allowed me to travel around pretty easily. But part of the result of that was we sent the battalion over 100 people at a time on airplanes, jet transports. And the first group that went over went and we relieved, I'll back up a step, when we went there we relieved another battalion which was already there. So it was like a man-for-man relief. We'd go in, our people would come in, their people would come back. So So the same planes that took us to Vietnam from Rhode Island took their guys back. And then they were, we were all in this cycle. At one point there were 21 battalions in the Navy doing this. Either from Rhode Island, from Louisiana, Mississippi rather, and California. There were 3 locations where we operated out of, but in our case it was Rhode Island. So I was on what they call the advance party, our first plane in. And we were met by our counterparts. No, that's not true. They met us with a bunch of trucks, and we got on the trucks and drove out to the camp where our particular battalion was going to be, which turned out to be on a very nice bay and beach, if you could ignore the barbed wire. But this was Da Nang Bay, a big logistical complex. A couple of battalions there, headquarters. The whole place was just, I'm going to say around Da Nang probably for a 10-mile radius. Very intense activities, support activities of one kind or another, the airfield, tank farms, camps of one kind or another, and very active. Constant ships coming in and unloading. There were anti-aircraft defenses on the hilltops because of we were fairly close to North Vietnam. And so it was a very active place. So in terms of traumatic change, there really wasn't one at all in my case.
So what could you expect in a typical day?
Well, for that trip, the typical day, first of all, we lived on the beach, which I was accustomed to already anyhow. We lived in plywood and corrugated steel huts, buildings, 16 feet by 32 feet. Standard thing. We built thousands of them in Vietnam. They're building similar things today, or they were, in Iraq and Afghanistan and other places. Typical day, breakfast in a mess hall, and we had great food. And then my day would involve, for the most part, checking on our security. The guys who were, we had fortified camps with sand berms pushed up around them and some bunkers every so often. A sand, what's a better description? Dig a ditch, put the pile of sand up along one side, and then on top of, in front of that, you'd have barbed wire tangles because there were no front lines in Vietnam to speak of. So no matter where you were, you had to have some sort of defensive capability. So we would have a series of bunkers made out of heavy timbers, sandbags, armed with machine guns and grenade launchers, that kind of stuff. Typically 3 guys manning each one. So you'd have the bunkers armed or manned all night. During the daytime, it was very safe. Virtually nothing happened in that particular area. So part of my job was to make sure the security guys were doing their job. So talking to them, be planning for other, very mundane stuff to some degree. You're always looking ahead to where you're going next, so somebody's got to be doing some organizing on that. That was part of that job. Making sure that the radios worked, that we had communications with the other units that were around us, and I also had the ordnance guys, so our armory, maintaining the weapons that we had. So that was part of the day, and then what I would typically do would be to go and drive out to surrounding Marine infantry battalion headquarters and get their report as to what kind of action went on the night before and what they were expecting, and so that we could at least, you know, were aware generally of what was going on around us from a combat perspective. Of course, our primary function for the rest of the guys in the battalion is construction, and they're going out and building everything imaginable, from roads, bridges, you know, fuel tanks, water tanks, watchtowers, barracks, and housing of every description. We built aircraft, parking aprons for aircraft. It was just a huge variety of stuff, which made it very, very interesting, fascinating. But for that particular piece, my job was more to be in the overhead kind of things, of making sure that we were safe, or at least we were ready if anything were to happen. We had there was barbed wire entanglements everywhere. On the plus side, it was a beautiful beach, and in fact, I think today there are resorts there. But we had barbed wire and machine guns. But then, typically, that was so long ago now, I can't even remember a lot of the different parts of that. But we'd come back and make sure my commanding officer knew what was going on, and the other, the various company commanders. Nighttime, to some degree, you could sit and watch the war go on around us, see artillery in the hillsides, and some shooting, but it wasn't, for the most part, not very intense at that stage.
So what would you say was your proudest moment while you were over there?
It was a different deployment. The second trip when I went over, I was a company commander, and I commanded 125 guys whose job it was to run a rock quarry, and that was back in the hills. We were providing our own security as well as a 24, 6.5 day a week cycle of construction, of quarrying. So we drilled, the only place we could find good rock was on the top of the mountains. So we had a group of guys up there drilling and blasting rock, and shoveling it out, loading it on trucks, hauling it down a haul road. Down at the bottom we had rock crushers. And there were about 125 guys there. And that had the same kind of bunker security. We'd clear off the ridges so that they were bare, so you could see in between. And there were no, in our particular case, there were no friendly units between us and, I guess, Laos, which was 20, 30 miles away.
What was Laos?
Laos, the country right behind South Vietnam, part of Indochina, and it was occupied at that point by the North Vietnamese. You guys probably didn't hear about the Ho Chi Minh Trail, or maybe you've heard about it in passing, but that was the means by which the North Vietnamese supplied their units and the Viet Cong units in the south. They ran that down through countries outside South Vietnam. We weren't allowed, we did it, but for the most part there was a reluctance to go from South Vietnam into another country. The North Vietnamese didn't care about that. They figured out how to bring their supplies down, and so that was going on out beyond where we were at the time. But that was January of the time I'm talking about right now, January of '68, which was the Tet Offensive. People who are my age would still remember that, but it was one of 3 or 4 attempts of North Vietnam to overrun South Vietnam and take control of it. This was in '68. They had tried it in '65, tried it again in '72, and they finally succeeded in '75 after we had left. But in '68, part of what was happening, we knew something was happening, we didn't know how big it was. And so we had gone up on these bunkers that we had up on this ridge line. One of them was a Marine, manned by Marines, 5 Marines. And their job was to look out over the valley south of Da Nang, and they could pick out where the North Vietnamese were launching rockets or into the Da Nang airfield. And so the Marines' job was to call in artillery fire and adjust it, and so that they hit those targets. Well, the North Vietnamese, knowing they were going to do that in a big way for this attack, decided they needed to take that observation post out. And fortunately, we knew, like I said, we knew enough stuff was going on. We had actually gone up there and added a couple of more fighting positions, and I actually had some sailor or some of our Seabees added to the Marines in that particular bunker. Seabees were on top of it, the Marines were in it and around it. And we were surprised by an attack on that particular location. And with hindsight, what the North Vietnamese were trying to do was to take out that post so that Marine artillery couldn't be called in on their own forces when they were launching the rockets. And when they did that, they attacked the bunker, wounded all 5 Marines in the first couple of shots. But my guys came back and fought back, and went on for probably a half an hour or so. And the next morning we went up to check out what had occurred, and discovered that what was happening was we knew the North Vietnamese had climbed up the back of where we had pushed the dirt on, so they were up at that break point shooting from there. And I had sent some guys off to one side, and they ended up with, they could see where the firing was coming from, so they were shooting back. And in between was all this barbed wire. So we, next morning we're up there and checking it out, and of course we had to take care of all the Marines during the night. And discovered that there was one North Vietnamese soldier dead in the wire, and he had actually got caught in a crossfire. So that was a little unusual. But at the time, I had to go over to the First Marine Division's headquarters, because I was part of their defense. We were part of their perimeter. And it was the only time, I think, probably, that the Navy Seabees were actually commended for being the only people that could inflict casualties on the enemy at that particular time. All the Marines that were around us involved, nobody had managed to do that. So that was a nice thing to hear. I mean, despite its rather gory happening, but people who have been in the service know that there's a certain amount of inner rivalry, but that was during the Tet Offensive, which was a very interesting time on the second trip, and I forgot what the other half of your question was, or was there another half?
I'm just getting to it. What would have been your darkest memory of the time?
I thought about that driving down here, actually. There weren't very many dark memories at all. There was so much going on, but it was typically the frustration of being able to get things done while everybody's moving. I mean, it was was just an amazing thing on the whole country. Part of what I was doing at the same time was moving part of our quarry operation 50 or 100 miles north, closer to North Vietnam and outside the city away. And so we were moving equipment, and it was, some over the road, some by water. Well, the last leg of that, I had to take from the city away. The northern part of it, we could look across and see North Vietnamese flags, was still owned by them when we were on the south side. And I had to run a convoy and trucks loaded with bulldozers and construction equipment and dump trucks that we needed out there and all sorts of stuff. We were driving along through an area where there were no friendly forces, because my quarry was at a fire support, or at a simple location out 5 or 6 miles upstream from Way, and the Marines had a fire support base there as well. But in order to get there and to drive through these roads, I had driven there a week earlier, and I should have been a lot more scared than I was at the time with hindsight, but I had only done it once, so I wasn't real sure of the terrain, and I had to run this convoy out there, and we made a wrong turn, or I should say we missed a turn. I was dealing with some cavalry guys who were escorting us, and they missed the turn. And then we had to turn around these trucks out in the middle of what we called Indian country. Back them all up, turn them around, get on the right road, and get down. And there was a dark moment there, because we knew there was nobody friendly, within supporting distance that we could see or contact. And the world could turn pretty badly here, but it didn't. And so, then we actually were able to finish that. But in reality, that's minor stuff compared to anybody who was in the front edge, the leading edge of the fighting over there. Most of us were rear area types, although there was no rear area per se. And I guess I'd observed, my time as construction, the people who had my greatest respect in Vietnam were first the infantry grunts, who were patrolling every night, both Army and Marine, and I dealt with both. Those guys were incredible. Great deal of courage, stamina, went back and did it again. And that's where most of the casualties were. And the other two groups of people that were very impressive at the time, the first were helicopter pilots, Army ones in particular. Most of them were 18, 19 years old. They were right out of fast cars in high school, and they flew the helicopters the same way. And it was amazing, and they would take them into the heaviest fighting, and then could again come back and do it again and again and again. And then the third group I admired were the nurses, because they had to deal with, the carnage that kind of fighting produces. They were treating our wounded as well as anybody we captured. If they were wounded, they'd take them too, and a lot of civilian casualties as well. The rest of us, which was most of us, I think didn't see anything near the stress and the toughness of that kind of a war. Those three groups of people. Plenty of people had a lot of hard work going on, but those were special.
So when you returned home for the final time, what was that like?
Interesting. First of all, just getting out of Vietnam was a bit of an adventure. I started by bumming a helicopter ride from the infantry battalion commander, paratrooper, to get from my fire support base into an airfield away. So that was a helicopter ride. Next, it was a C-130 ride, aircraft down to Da Nang. That was interesting because the plane was had no seats in it at all. It was pure cargo, just an open deck. There were probably 100 to 150 of us, I think, on that airplane. All of us just sitting on the deck, no seat belts, no nothing, just fly in a C-130. And that was that leg. The next leg was riding bumming a ride on one of our dump trucks from my parent unit that I knew where to go, where they were. And that was riding out through another combat area to get to their headquarters, which was another beach location in a place called Hoi An. And they in turn were supporting the Korean Marines. We had a brigade of Korean Marines. And they had an American construction battalion supporting them. Yeah, so I had to check out there. We bummed another helicopter ride back to Da Nang. And it, a couple of times, made very strange noises with loud bangs behind where we were sitting. Went from there, flew across the, I guess first to Okinawa. And I do remember when we left Okinawa asking where the next stop was, because we'd made these trips before and it might have been Midway or Anchorage, Alaska, or further on in Japan, and they said at the time, today's world, San Bernardino, California. Couldn't believe it, 12-hour flight. The best sleep I've ever had on an airplane, coming back. And then a flight from LA to New York City, and had an engine blowout on that one on takeoff. That was unusual. Back to LA and then back there. Finally flew to Albany, New York, and arrived there at 7 a.m. in the morning. Called my wife. There weren't any cell phones then. She came to pick me up. And so there it is. That was the return from Vietnam. Sitting on the curb, 6:30 in the morning at Albany Airport. And, I was happy to be there. It had taken probably about 5 days to make that trip.
So how does the war at Vietnam affect you today, if at all?
Oh, well, it was such a learning experience. Dwelt on that at all. It was a fantastic experience for a 24, 25-year-old like I was. And things that I've done, well, today, retired, not quite the same, but my entire life, there were things I used all the time from what I learned there. A lot of organizational stuff, how to function in an organization, and then the idea of having the level of responsibility so early. In that Tet area, or the Tet Offensive, I was 25. And at one point I had, with one other officer, 250 of the 750 sailors in our battalion were under my command. That's incredible. It was, it didn't last long, but nonetheless it was something they did. But to be responsible for running those kind of an operations all the time, everything was 24/7, except for Sunday afternoon, sometimes. And the experience gained there was just terrific. How to function, dealing with other organizations, stuff coming at you of various kinds from different directions. I think it was certainly a very significant part in my life. Still living it that way.
So, lastly, how do you think the military is doing today in its job?
Well, actually, I think it's doing very well. Um, well, let me back up a step too, because what I did after the Vietnam tour, my next tour happened to be at the Naval Prison in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. And I was the public works officer up there and had 300 guys working for me there. Of course, they were all prisoners, but that was okay because the job was to teach them a trade. And so these were all kids, 18, 19, Marines and sailors who'd gotten in trouble. Our job was to try and teach them a skill before they went back out into the real world, and most of them did. But then after that, I went into the reserves, and the last job I had there was at the Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island, supporting the activities they do there, particularly wargaming on an international scope. And that particular tour was from 1985 to 92. And during that time period, which came as a real surprise to us, in 85, the Soviet Union was peaking. This was the end of the Cold War. And we were involved in the strategic planning and the process of how we would fight the Soviet Union if we had to. And at that time, you felt that my life would probably be over before we finally were through dealing with communism. Expected it to outlast us. And it was a major thing. We tend to forget it these days, the Cold War. Well, almost all of a sudden in 1989, Soviet Union came unglued. And among other things, the Berlin Wall came down a couple of years later. And the bottom line was at that point that they said, well, now that we've won the Cold War, we don't need you guys in the Navy anymore. So at that point, I had to retire. It was in 1992. Just in time for Saddam Hussein to invade Kuwait, by the way. That was picking up as we were getting out. But I think today, when I look at today's military, it is much better than it has ever been. It's better led. It's better equipped. It's incredibly powerful. We are so fortunate to have it. And we forget that for virtually the entire 20th century, we were paying a pretty healthy chunk of our gross national product in order to defend ourselves. Running perhaps 5% or so. Today we're down around 2%, if that. So we're getting a great deal for what we pay. No, I think this is this is as good a time as the United States military has ever had. We're not perfect, for sure, never have been. It's not easy. But we are darned fortunate to have those folks out there right now. Some of them flying over Syria. There's still plenty in Afghanistan. Who knows what's going to happen there? The Navy is all over the world. We forget that Russia still has, Russia now, not the Soviet Union, still has the ability to destroy this country if they choose to do it. We need, with nuclear weapons, they're still there. The Navy's out there today, with some help from the Air Force, providing a deterrent that says, don't think you're going to do that if you want to have breakfast tomorrow morning. So we have a nuclear deterrent out there. The Navy also has probably the best ballistic missile defenses that we have today. better at that than anybody else. It's probably not good enough to totally protect this country, so you don't want to have a nuclear attack at all if you can avoid it. Hence the reason for the deterrent force. So, but we ask people to go, whether it's into Syria or wherever it is. We're in good shape at this point.
All right. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Pleasure.